there, my name is Amy Boulware, and this is
Irv Ginsburg, Papa Irv.
And we are starting another session of Ask Poppa. We have been doing this for actually a couple of weeks now, since we have been sheltering in place during the coronavirus. And Dad, over here, is one of the most social people that we know, and he's been having a really hard time with not being out and about doing his activities and being around his friends. And so this is something that I have always wanted to do, is record his stories and just have this for our own family. But what we found is that we are hearing from friends and family and people from actually all over the world telling us how they're enjoying this and looking forward to it. So we hope they're not just saying that to appease our egos or his ego, but it doesn't matter. If you're sending us notes, if you're liking us, that is giving him and me the reinforcements that we need to keep on going. So here we go. We're gonna start, we have kind of an interesting theme this time. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the merchants and the people that Dad interacted with in New York when he was a child. And then we're going to talk about preparing for Passover, because most everybody knows, who is watching this, knows that we're Jewish. And we will be celebrating Passover next week, which will be very strange for us because we usually do it in a big crowd of people with lots of folks either at our table or at friends and family's tables. So this will be a weird Passover for us, a different one. But we are going to talk about his Passovers of the past. So the first thing, one of our viewers, our friend Jay Zuckerman, asked a question about Dad's memories of his favorite thing at Madison Square Garden. So I'm going to ask him about an experience that he remembers very vividly. So Dad, can you tell us the story about, he's laughing, I haven't even asked the question. Dad, can you tell us the story about going to the circus every year with your dad and your brother, and your most memorable circus experience at Madison Square Garden?
Absolutely. And by the way, all of these stories are true. They may be slightly embellished, but nobody is around anymore to be able to tell you what the embellishment was. So let's assume they're all true. My dad used to take my brother and I to the circus every spring. And it just happened that the circus was always during the Passover holiday, which meant we couldn't have any snacks at the circus. Number one, they weren't kosher, but they also weren't kosher for Passover. But my dad was a terrible driver, and he really didn't drive very much. But I remember one year we drove down to Madison Square Garden. We lived in the Bronx. And I can't tell you how we got there, and I'm not sure that if he were alive that he'd be able to tell you how he got there, because he was also bad at directions. But we get to Madison Square Garden, and now he's got to find a parking spot. And we're driving down a street that was immediately adjacent to the garden. And the car runs out of gas right near the entrance to the Madison Square Garden, where they brought in the circus elephants from outside. And the police almost went nuts. And my dad had no idea what he was going to do. The bunch of police officers came over, and they somehow picked up the car and moved it away from the entrance, and the elephants went in. I don't remember how we actually got into the into the garden to see the circus, but we did. And every year we used to talk about this story, and we used to laugh. And as we became adults, we realized how serious it was. Imagine blocking the entrance and having elephants waiting outside while we're sitting in, I think, a 1947 Plymouth.
Dad, speaking of Papa Harry and driving, why don't you tell them the story about how he actually got his driver's license?
My dad, as you know, had a butcher shop, and during the war, and immediately after the war, he was really busy.
World
He used
War
to work-
II he's
World
talking
War
about.
II, yeah, not the Civil War, but World War II, and he couldn't take time off to go get a license, but he had a car, and so he paid one of the kids in the neighborhood to go take his driver's test. And I got to tell you, that was indicative of the kind of driving that he did because he was never a good driver. And we always used to be frightened to drive with him. And immediately after the war, in 1949, he bought a Packard, which was the cream of the line. And they used to have a motto, ask the man who owns one. Well, I think my dad was put on the blacklist not to be asked. He had trouble with that car from the day he picked it up. And I'm not quite sure how much of it had to do with the way he drove or whether it had anything to do with the car. But it was an awful car, and he got rid of it shortly thereafter.
I love that story. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about, Dad has a lot of memories about all of the individual shopkeepers and little shops that were on the street. It was very different than now where you go to, a big grocery store and you get everything you need. Back then, it was individual little shops next to his dad's butcher shop. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of those, his memories of those shops and the shopkeepers, and then some mischievous stories of Dad and some of these shopkeepers. Okay, go ahead, Dad. Tell us about kind of the different shops and things like that.
Okay, let me start off first. The name of the street was kind of interesting. And Amy, you've never heard this story. The name of the street was Featherbed Lane. Okay, remember, Featherbed Lane. And the legend had it that during the Revolution, Washington's troops were coming through what turned out to be our eventual neighborhood, though you'd never know it. And in order to keep the hooves of the horses quiet, the people who lived nearby put out feather beds, and so that the horses would ride. Now, whether this is true or not, I wouldn't take it to the bank. But I mean,
so we're just saying he was not around during George Washington's time, but apparently this is a story they told on his street. Who knows? Maybe it is true.
And we lived on Shakespeare Avenue, so Shakespeare Avenue intersected with Featherbed Lane, and actually, during the winter when there was snow, we lived at the top of a hill and we would sled down the middle of the street into the business district. You talk about unsafe. It was incredible.
Actually, I think I have a picture of you and Uncle Robbie
with a
sledding.
sled.
I'll have to look for that and show it at our next time.
It was an amazing experience. But let me tell you about the street. The street it was actually 2 city blocks. And it started at Nelson Avenue, and from Nelson Avenue to McCombs Road. So those of you that are listening who are from the neighborhood, you'll recognize what I'm talking about. So there was Nelson Avenue, there was Shakespeare Avenue, there was Jessup Avenue, and then there was McCombs Road. And McCombs Road actually ended the business district. But starting at the corner of Shakespeare Avenue and Featherbed Lane, there was a drugstore, immediately next to it, a kosher meat market. Next to that kosher meat market was Deitch's Super Dairy. Then there was Hoyer's Fruit Market, which was an enormous fruit market. And then there was the bakery and a small hardware store and a bakery that had the best breads, rolls, and challahs and cakes that you could ever imagine. And then next to my dad's store was a stationery store that sold stationery stuff. Then my dad, and next to my dad's market, and by the way, I don't know why I remember this, but his market was at 105 Featherbed Lane. And a couple of years ago, I went on to Google to see the picture, and it's all gone. There's just a bunch of big stores. Next to his market was a kosher deli, and then immediately on the other side of the kosher deli was a non-kosher market. And then there was a candy store owned by the Kaplans. And next to that was Denny's Fruit Market, and I'll tell you about that in just a little bit. And then as we went down, there was another hardware store of some sort. And right next to them, later on, a pizza store came in, just selling sliced pizza. And then there were a bunch of other stores that I don't remember. And at the very end of the street was Baumol's Children's Clothing Store. Okay, let's go back to Denny's Fruit Market, which was 2 or 3 doors down from my dad. My dad, everything, they didn't have anything come in that was packaged. Everything was cut to order, and they would get the 4 quarters of beef. But every couple of weeks, he would get in a load of steer heads. And they would trim them up, and they would take the cheeks, but the real prize was the tongue.
Gross, gross, gross. I'm going to tell you, he used to make it when I was a kid, and it was gross, tough and nasty, but he loves it.
When it's pickled. Though my mother used to do, she used to roast it as well, and that was good, but totally different. Well, one day I was in the shop when he got in a load of the steer heads, and why I did this, I don't have a clue. And I don't remember how old I was, but I was old enough to know better. I took one of the knives and I cut out an eyeball. Think about this. And I took the eyeball and I walked down to Denny's Fruit Market and I put it in a box of plums. And Denny had seen me come in. He had no idea that I was, well, I heard about that for years after that. My dad he never really got mad at me, but he sure got mad at me at that point. But it's interesting.
What was punishment? Did you get punished for it?
I honestly don't remember. Maybe it was it was one of those times. It was a time for an education. I learned my lesson. I didn't do it again.
But take eyeballs and put them places?
But let me tell you another story about this. Is one of the things that I have thought about a lot as I have grown older. People ask me, what are the messages that you got from your parents? And there are a lot of messages. I learned a lot, about empathy, about, concern for others. But I think one of the lessons that I learned most significantly had to do with something that happened in my dad's shop, and I used to help there quite a bit.
We call him an SOB, son of a butcher.
Okay, and just before all of the Jewish holidays, it was very busy. And it had to be probably around Hanukkah because it was cold. And a woman came in. I had never seen her, and I know my dad had never seen her either. And she was wearing a heavy overcoat. And we used to have a room in the back where one of the butchers would be plucking chickens, and my mom actually helped to pluck chickens also. They used to come in with feathers. And I saw this woman slip a chicken under her coat. And as she was getting ready to leave, I grabbed hold of my dad and I said, "Dad, that lady just stole a chicken." And he says to me in Yiddish, "Soll sein Shah," which means just keep your mouth shut. And after she left, he said to me, "Erwin, if she needed the chicken that bad, she needed the chicken that bad, and I didn't. You need to keep that in mind." And I tell you, that has traveled with me in my entire life. He was absolutely one of the most sensitive guys, and tough as nails. But when it came to being involved with other people, there was never any question. But soll sein Shah, do not embarrass the lady. Now let me tell you about some of one of the other shops. I mentioned that there was a pizza shop. Now, we could not bring pizza into the house other than we could bring cheese pizza in, and it was only my brother and I that would eat it. But we could not bring it into the kitchen. We would have to sit in the hallway and eat it on the floor. And we could only use paper napkins. We couldn't use any of the cloth napkins. And that was, just another experience. But Amy mentioned about Passover. Passover was a big deal for us. I mean, it was not only family and friends getting together, but it was the food. And it would always start off with my dad making horseradish. Now, for those of you that know horseradish, you know that it comes in a bottle. At our house, it came raw, and my dad would make the horseradish. He would ribe it. He would grate it on a hand grater. But when he did that, we all had to leave the house because it was like a gassing. The horseradish was so strong, and I actually miss it, though it would never make a good aftershave lotion, but it sure did smell good. And my mother also, just before Passover, would be changing out the house. Now, a couple of things. One, if we were to get the apartment painted, it would always be immediately before Passover, and it would be done by painters. Not painters, painters. Where that came from?
Could she not say?
Huh?
So we should have said this, that both of my grandparents were immigrants, and their first language was not English. And my dad's first language was not English. His first language was Yiddish. So they both had Eastern European accents. So maybe she just couldn't say painter. Maybe it was painter.
The painter. And the painter would come and, so we'd be in and out of the house, somewhat infrequently. But then my mother would change out the dishes. Now, she had, at best estimate, 7 or 8 sets of dishes. But there were 3 sets of dishes that would only be used on Passover. And where would these dishes come from? Most of them were premiums from going to the movies. The movies, if you went, I forget, on a Tuesday or a Wednesday, they would give you a cup or a dish or whatever. And she had more collections of these things. And when I say 6 or 7 sets, none of them matched. There was nothing that matched, but that was unimportant. The food that went on it was great. Now, she used to make everything from scratch. And one of the big things for Passover was gefilte fish. And she would get her fish from Tony the Fishman, who also had a store on Featherbed Lane. And one of the fishes that she used was live carp. And she would go in, and Tony would pick out whatever carp she wanted, and then he would cut it up and take the scales off. But then she would bring it home, and somehow it would be ground and stuffed into the fish skins. And it sounds awful.
For those of you watching who are not Jewish, and even some of our friends who are, you would say that this was not a good tasting thing. It is definitely an acquired taste. Some people in our family like it. Some people do not like it. Dad and I are like it. But he does not make it from fresh fish anymore. He tried once, I think, and it was more work than worth it.
And it really brings an odor to the house that probably lasts for weeks.
Yeah, and since he lives with me now in our house, we have not done it.
But it was good. It was good. But of course, the Passover Seder was always a big deal at our house. And my mother used to cook, I think, for a week before the first Seder. And it was just...
Dad, what about the Passover wine? Where did you get the Passover wine?
Oh, yeah, the Passover wine. My dad had a customer, and I can't remember his name. I just don't remember his name. You think you'd never forget these things, so make sure you start writing things down when you're younger. But this fellow used to make his own wine in the apartment building that he lived in their basement. And he would bring us a gallon of kosher wine. And if I remember correctly, it was just a step above grape juice, but we always looked forward to it, and it was always a great addition to our Passover holiday. But my mother was an incredible cook, and she could make stuff up. And we used to miss bagels, and she had a recipe for Passover bagels, which I can still taste, but I can't remember, or I never knew how to make them.
So, for those of our friends out there who are listening who don't know, during Passover, part of the Passover story is about unleavened bread. And so, during Passover, we do not eat anything made with flour.
Or no, yeast.
Or yeast.
No, flour we do.
Flour, yeast. So, leavening. So anyway, there's a lot of different kinds of food that we eat during Passover. We also follow a Seder, and the Seder is the meal, and then we use a Haggadah, which is the
order
of service. So, Dad, tell us about the Haggadahs you used to have when you were a kid.
We only used the Maxwell House Coffee Haggadah. And for years, I did not know that there was anything other than the Maxwell House Coffee Haggadah. Never thought about it. It turns out that Maxwell House Coffee published a Haggadah that they gave out free every year just before Passover. And we must have had 100 of them in the house.
Why do you think Maxwell House? I mean, that's kind of a strange thing. Why do you think that was?
It was a strange thing. Who knows?
Dad, as we finish up this segment, talk just for a minute about growing up in an area, and this is, I say for a minute, but that was all Jewish. I mean, generally, mostly Jewish. So when you talk about, getting a Haggadah in the grocery store, that's a little different than going to the grocery store in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where we live now. And having everybody around you. I mean, your father was a kosher butcher, kosher bakeries, all those kinds of things, and that was... just a way of life.
And by the way, the bakery closed during Passover. You couldn't get anything at the bakery for the week of Passover. But it's true. In fact, let me tell you a little bit about the neighborhood. It was probably 97% Jewish. I only had one non-Jewish friend, and maybe he'll be watching this at some point in time. His name was Olaf Olafsson.
Is that for real? That's a for real name?
It's a for real name. And all of us used to go to Hebrew school. We would go Monday through Thursday, and Friday we did not, and Saturday we were at services. And he used to come to the Hebrew school with us, waiting for us in the lobby. And, it was it was just amazing. Now, the neighborhood school was PS 104. And, it wasn't until I was an adult and actually moved out of New York that I realized that schools had names. Our schools were numbers. And so PS 104 was an interesting school. First of all, they used to close for the Jewish holidays because all of the kids were Jewish and they would take off for the Jewish holidays. But all of the teachers were Irish Catholics. And during Christmas, we used to sing Christmas carols. And most of our parents were immigrants. And I never thought about it. And I think, I really like Christmas music and still do. But I mean, it was a bit strange that in this Jewish neighborhood, all the singing our Christmas carols. By the way, they have now changed the name of the school from PS 104 to the Shakespeare Academy, which I thought was kind of interesting. I then went to junior high school, and it was JHS 82. And unfortunately, I cannot remember the whole school song, but let me sing to you the introduction.
Oh my God.
All hail 82, all hail. But it had, it had a bunch of words, but I don't remember them. But I got to tell you, when Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner came out with the 2,000-year-old man, if you go back to that, they sing about Cave 34. And I almost came unglued when I first heard that. So keep in mind the melody. All hail 82, all hail. Thanks for coming today.
Thanks
this has
for
been
coming
just
today.
great.
For everybody who's concerned about us being matchy-matchy, you can see that we are both wearing red, white, and blue today. And we are so happy that you guys joined us, that you're enjoying this as much as we are. We love to hear from our friends and family. And so if you like us, love us, want us to keep doing, don't want us to keep doing, you can let us know on our Facebook pages. We are excited to share more with you. Our next segment will be talking about some of the things that happened when I was a little kid and we were growing up. We have some fun stories then as well. And we are thrilled to be providing you guys with Ask Poppa. We're talking about getting a theme song. Neither of us can sing, as you can tell, and I don't even try. But if anybody has any suggestions, we'd be happy to have you add them for us. Anyway, we appreciate you, and we hope you guys have a great day.
Cheerio.
Bye.